Hey guys, I'm Naya and welcome back to the channel. For today's video, we're going to be talking about cards you probably should be picking up before Photon Hypernova. The set is coming out in about 3 weeks time, so we should probably start preparing for it in case you haven't started to prepare already. So with these cards, I'm going to be mentioning a couple specific cards and engines, archetypes, all of that for you to be picking up basically. So yeah, just getting started for the first archetype that I mentioned a lot in my previous videos. Actually, it's going to be the Plunder Patrol stuff. So I think with Plunder Patrol, like, it's kind of weird. The deck is really interesting, but what it was lacking is because it needs to rely on the opponent to give them plays, it had inherently some bad matchups because of how the deck is essentially made. Now, it is quite an accessible deck post its reprints in Ghost of the Past, The Second Haunting, and Battles of Legend, Crystal Revenge, I think it was. Another thing is that all of the ships, basically, that you play, that you go into through your effects, they weren't out yet at the point of the deck's release. So as it was gradually receiving support, the deck started to become better and better and being a rogue contender. But because you didn't have any plays going for yourself, unless you were dependent on your opponent, they decided to release the new ship in Photon Hypernova, the Plunder Patrol ship, Yord, I think, where basically you give yourself a token, your opponent a token, and you give yourself plays essentially. So I think that's a really, really nice piece of support. And the deck itself will probably move quite high up in the rogue category or even become better than that. It is a deck that rewards just really good and clean gameplay when it comes to it, I think. And another engine that it can be played with is the adventure stuff. And with that, we can actually move on to the next thing I wanted to mention on this list, which is the adventure engine. Like, the engine itself basically fell off around the time that the POT format came. And with that, like, everybody just sort of put it to the side. But the engine was never hit on any ban list. And it is a very nice engine to include in a deck where you can afford to include it in, because it does have some restrictions, but it's not that bad. It's just generic almost negation and extra bodies that it provides for any deck that abuses it, basically, because it does abuse it. Let's be real. Like, if you look back at the base decks and prank kits with all of that, like, the engine is really, really strong. And right now we're also looking at it because Kashtira can play it as well. Like, they are not that dependent on their normal summon, so they can use that as an additional piece of negation, which the deck desperately needs. And there's just different versions you can play, different versions people are testing, but some of them are turning to the adventure engine. And I think if you want to run a deck that can utilize this engine, you probably should start picking the cards up as soon as possible. And Changes is quite cheap because it got a reprint in the OTS pack. So it's a bit more accessible than Rite of Aramesir, for example, which is still quite expensive, but yeah, you know, you can decide for yourself if you want to be picking the engine up. But I think it has a ton of potential moving forward in some decks. So there's that. So for the next engine, I'm also going to say it's a bit weird. So when it comes to the Gishki stuff, I wanted to mention it because they are receiving support in Photon Hypernova, and the deck, or the engine I should say, can be paired together with Sprite. But the downside of it is that I think that the pure Sprite version moving forward is still going to be better, just because the engine is really, really big. So you need to include it in the Sprite deck and really, like, just perfect the build. And I go in depth about this if you look at a couple videos back when we did the how to build Sprite Gishki from scratch, you know, building a deck from scratch. So make sure to check that video out to listen to us go into detail about how the engine is maybe not that great and what you need to think about if you're going to be playing it in Sprite. And another, like, downside about it is that if you look at Gishki Abyss, there's two things you need to ask yourself. Like, are you going to invest in it based on whether or not Sprite is going to get hit on the ban list, and whether or not those cards are actually going to receive a reprint, and when? So when it comes to the reprint, we cannot know, but if Sprite gets hit, a couple versions that might emerge from that basically is people might start playing Sprite with Tri Brigades, and they might start playing Sprite with Gishkis. And at that point, the card might get even more expensive if it doesn't receive a reprint. So there's a couple things to think about. So yeah, I wanted to mention Gishki. Together with Gishki, there's also Ibli. So the Ibli lock has been present in the game for some time now. Not all the time, but there's always decks that pop up that can play the Ibli lock, and I wanted to mention it because we actually put Ibli and the Ibli lock in that video in the deck that we make. And Ibli is just really nice. It's a floodgate, and it's also quite unexpected at times. And I also wanted to mention it because Kashtira can run it together with Almiraj as well. So it's not only Sprite Gishki, it's also Kashtira. And yeah, if you want to be running that, Ibli is something you probably should be picking up. Cartesia is another card worth mentioning because it did go up in price quite a lot when it started to see play in deck lists that are post Photon Hypernova for branded SP Abishio. So with the 2 new fusions from Photon Hypernova, Cartesia is the material on one of them. And both of them can be part of your end board. Like, branded is just going to get even more explosive and do even more things. So Cartesia essentially is going to go up in price, and you are going to have to pick it up as soon as possible, because it's going to go even higher probably. And it just got printed in Darkwing Blast. So if you want to be running branded, you probably should be picking up the entire engine and all of it ASAP. And yeah, Cartesia is going to be one of those cards, so I wanted to mention it to you as well. Then moving on to Big Eye. So Big Eye is the generic rank 7 Xyz monster that's going to be seeing play in the Kashtira deck. Its effect is really nice, being able to steal the opponent's monster, because essentially you can do many different things. You can either break a board, you can either force things, or you can take their resources if you're playing a mirror match, for example, to take a Kashtira, summon your Arise card very easily. So it's also utilizing your opponent's resources as your own. So yeah, Big Eye being around $10 for almost every single copy, except for like the mad expensive ones when it comes to the OT and all of that. You probably should just pick it up if you want to play Kashtira. We again don't know if it's going to receive a reprint or not, but it is going to be very, very useful in that deck. And also talking about cards that counter the deck, obviously, Book of Eclipse. I mention it all the time lately. It is going to be one of the go-to options to counter the Kashtira deck. Essentially, you are turning off everything. Book of Eclipse is going to flip everything face down, and you are going to not have to deal with a Rise card being a Macrocosmos, with Shangri-Ira locking your zones, with cards like Fenrir and Unicorn being ready to disrupt you at any given moment. So you turn everything off, but then there is the downside. Well, there's two. They can ash you, and also if you don't break their board, they get resources in the end phase, which is not that great. So you need to have some kind of game plan together with Book of Eclipse, but it is going to be a really nice card to counter that strategy. And in tandem with that, I wanted to mention also Zeus. So Zeus is going to be insane, I think, with being able to break through the Kashtira board, because like I said, they usually don't have any negates up, and if you book everything, the easiest way to get rid of everything is going to be Zeus. And because it's also quite generic in a sense where it can be played pretty much in any extra deck that utilizes Xyz monsters, you should probably invest in Zeus because it's going to be very, very useful moving forward. And also, if you play Dweller as well, you can also use Zeus against Tier Element, using Dweller first, then Zeus, which is also an option for you there. So also, if you are picking it up, you probably should invest into 2 copies, because if you want to have a card that's going to counter a strategy, and we also mentioned that in that video that I mentioned before, like, you need to play 2 copies because they are going to take away the 1 copy you have if they know you are going to just break through their board with the help of it. So yeah, you need to have 2. And for another generic card, and then we're going to go back to a couple counters to Kashtira, another generic card is going to be Triple Tactic Talent. So Talent is going to be live most of the time. It's how decks are being created basically lately. Like, everything is playing during the opponent's turn. Almost every single deck is going to be activating something, so Talent is going to come in handy. And in tandem with Triple Tactic Tasking, it's also searchable, so you probably should be investing into Talent. It had some reprints, and you can probably get some accessible copies for yourself, and it's also going to be nice just to keep as a staple in case you haven't invested into that card already. And going back to the counters to Kashtira, Kurikara Divincarnate is a card that's been, talked about quite a lot recently, and it's very, very useful, but it is one of those cards where if your opponent just sort of predicts it's going to come down, they might try to play around it. But again, you are sort of forced to activate something during your opponent's turn, so it might be live most of the time, and you are removing the monster, and you can also make it big enough where it's able to beat over another thing, and giving you a monster in the end phase is very, very free. So you should keep that effect in mind as well, and not forget to activate it. It's very, very nice being able to take pretty much anything. And yeah, like, I think the card is going to be quite strong moving forward. And because it is like going up in price so fast, you probably should pick it up as soon as possible. And for the last card, again, a card to counter pretty much a lot of things, actually, not just Kashtira, it's going to be Lava Golem. So it's interesting to me. I think Lava Golem by itself is a really, really nice card, but it's interesting how sometimes it can be so strong, but it's not being utilized in a meta where decks cannot afford to run it. But right now, we are going to be in a format where a lot of decks can actually run it, and it can also be run against them. So it's going to be useful, and it's going to see play all across the board, I think. It's just nice. You know, it's not triggering any effects. It's getting rid of the monsters, but in the case of tier limits, for example, it's also turning off their spell and trap cards. However, a thing to keep in mind is that if they summon Hafinas, and also the new tier limits Kashtira, that's another way of making their trap cards live again. So that's something to think about. But sometimes, you know, they just have the Hafinas, and there's nothing for you to do about it except drawing an Ash. So there's that as well. And yeah, with that, I think that's pretty much going to be it. I'm sure there's a ton of other cards. We could be talking about like Kashtira extra deck options, Sprite extra deck options, just like tech cards, many other things, but we could be sitting here for an additional hour probably. So those are going to be the couple cards that I mentioned on this list. But if there's anything else that you would maybe want to talk about, you are always welcome to leave it in the comments down below. So if you like this video, of course, please like it, sub to the channel, check out all the social media, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.